All right, here we are. This is the AutoZone 51-111. $23. Kind of surprising for an 18-inch 3/8 spinner handle breaker bar. It's the reason I picked this up. It was surprisingly cheap. Totally seems like a Harbor Freight item. Is not. It's an AutoZone item. The bolt isn't quite centered, so it's Taiwanese made, but it's definitely budget. Definitely is budget. Pretty tight on the quality's okay, but they're letting a lot of stuff slide. That'd be in comparison to say maybe even the Harbor Freight icons. Surprisingly enough, the icons are made pretty nicely. They also have this nice heavy duty extra wide anvil. We're on the AutoZone. This is like a more of a classic anvil, and since these 3/8 breaker bars pretty much have the same fork width, you could maybe order a Snap-on or any number of brands 3/8 breaker bar anvils and then replace it in this AutoZone bar. I wish they would have put a little stronger anvil in this. The reviews say it holds up pretty well, and it is a forged, nice little forged bit. It just isn't quite as thick as maybe it could be up here at the top. 18 inches though, definitely handy for reach. Harbor Freight does have a long handle 3/8 breaker bar, but it's a half-inch one, say like this Mac V18F, where they just machine the anvil down to 3/8. So you get this really heavy-duty, really bulky 3/8 breaker bar, where this is just more tuned like a regular breaker bar, just with a really pretty long handle. As we can see here, just from the color of the chrome, it's a little bit deeper and thicker on the Harbor Freight icon. So surprisingly enough, it is a cheaper breaker bar. It's just so handy to have this kind of reach. Oftentimes it's using, you just want to use, or all you need is a 3/8 socket. But, the bolts are a little bit stubborn, say exhaust manifold bolts or brake caliper bolts, and you just want to have just a little bit of extra reach so you're not quite, going all the way down to the engine bay, just so you can get those bolts snapped and then run them out with an air ratchet or something, or an old vintage right ratchet for that matter. Also, say doing alignment work on vehicles, you often have these cam bolts where you have to loosen the nut and then you turn the bolt, which would say move the suspension control arm in and out to adjust camber. Oftentimes you got to adjust them and then hold that bolt in place while you tighten the nut, and sometimes when you're tightening the nut, the bolt wants to shift. And so this is a situation where a long handle breaker bar would be handy, just because it gives you more control to really hold the end of that cam bolt nice and steady while you're actually torquing the nut down. But sure, it is excessive. 18 inches long is easily more force than 3/8. The best 3/8 fails at 250 to 300 foot-pounds. That would just be the absolute best steel. And I'm suspecting this DuraLast is more along the 250 foot-pounds range. It really is just too much force. So that's one thing you'll have to be aware of is you start really flexing and feeling it strain, you probably should get a half-inch drive breaker bar. This does not replace a half-inch drive breaker bar, and if you're breaking lug nuts with it, especially like on a diesel pickup truck, I'm pretty sure you'll end up snapping the anvil sooner or later. It just is convenient and nice when you don't want to horse around with something quite as heavy and bulky as a half-inch drive. Just a nice thin handle, very long 3/8 drive breaker bar. If only the spring was this, you're going to have to take apart and find some kind of shim washer to put in there. Maybe even press the forks together in a vise or something, or frankly even with a hammer. I tightened the screw up about as tight as I could get it. This thing is still just too loose. They have a little undercut in the eye here where they insert a spring that kind of weakens the eye and makes sense why some people would have issues with the actual. It wasn't the anvil shearing, it was the eye actually failing. I will say though that it is actually pretty straight. Did appreciate that. These types of tools are oftentimes not made very straight, and so you'll want to double check on that. This one actually turned out pretty well. It's kind of hard to see in the camera here, but this whole shank is tapered. It's pretty thin down here and gets thicker and thicker as you get towards the head, which is absolutely logical. The leverage and the forces increase as you get closer to the fulcrum, and so you'll have to increase the thickness of the material, and surprisingly enough, way up here at the top of the neck. I don't know how easy it is to see on camera. Probably doesn't look like much of a difference, but it is actually a little bit thicker than the Icon. And once again, for 23 bucks, I thought that was kind of cool just to go into a store, and as long as AutoZone has these with their guaranteed for life, then if that anvil does snap, take it in there and get another one. And this thing is large. Here we have a proto, what is this, a 5467 half-inch drive breaker bar, substantially longer than that. And of course the same length as this Mac 18-inch bar. And I guess the last thing to note is that the knurling, at least on this one, came out pretty nice. It's actually pretty grippy, and that knurling on a spinner handle actually makes a lot of sense, kind of like the way they've done on these, you know, professional grade tools. Is once you've broken the bolt, if you have access and you turn it straight, that was the whole idea of these, so you can spin out the fastener nice and quickly. And surprisingly enough, knurling helps a lot when your hands are greasy, as they often are when you're doing mechanical work, versus the big trend these days is smooth tools. Obviously, if you have oily and greasy hands, you're not going to get much grip on a tool like that. So at least having some knurling right there will make a difference, and you know, at least until it gets clogged with grease and dirt. Anyway, I talked for too long about a simple tool, and so I'll go and end it here. I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing. And if you haven't subscribed, excuse me, please do. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.